Sacred warfare, when family becomes the spiritual battlefield. Thank you all for being here today. I stand before you humbled and honored to share insights from my profound conversation with Coletta Anderson, a visionary truth teller whose work has literally saved lives. Coletta's revolutionary approach to healing spiritual warfare within family systems has created safe havens where only darkness existed before. She walks fearlessly into the shadows that most spiritual leaders and therapists avoid, illuminating paths to freedom for those trapped in the most insidious form of abuse, spiritual manipulation by those who should love us most. Her courage in naming these experiences has given thousands permission to begin their own healing journeys. What makes Coletta's work so transformative is her refusal to accept comfortable lies. She challenges us to look unflinchingly at a truth many would rather deny. Sometimes the most dangerous battlefield isn't in some distant land, but at our own dinner tables, in our childhood bedrooms, in our family prayer circles. I want to start today by challenging a fundamental assumption that many of us hold sacred, that family and faith are always sources of protection and nurturing. We've been conditioned to believe that when these powerful forces combine, when our families are also our spiritual guides, we must be doubly blessed, doubly protected. But what if I told you that for millions of people, this combination creates not a sanctuary, but a war zone, a place where the very concepts meant to provide comfort and meaning become weapons of control, shame, and manipulation? This is the uncomfortable truth we must confront. Sometimes the most damaging spiritual warfare doesn't come from outside enemies, but from within our own family circles. Let me be crystal clear about what I mean by spiritual warfare in family context. I'm talking about the deliberate manipulation of religious beliefs, sacred texts, and spiritual practices to control, shame, or dominate family members. This isn't about theological disagreements or different expressions of faith. This is about weaponizing the divine against those we claim to love. The first insight I gained from my conversation with Coletta is that spiritual abuse is a legitimate and profoundly damaging form of psychological coercion. It's particularly devastating because it weaponizes one's deepest beliefs against them, creating confusion about their very identity and relationship with God. Imagine growing up being told that your natural emotions are sinful, that questioning family authority means questioning God Himself, that your worth is measured by your religious performance, that your trauma is God's will or a test of faith. These messages don't just hurt in the moment, they rewire your brain, reshape how you see yourself, others, and the entire universe. What makes this form of abuse so insidious is its invisibility, which brings me to our second insight. The warning signs of spiritual abuse often go unrecognized because they're disguised as religious duty or family obligation. When scripture is used to justify control, when religious teachings become tools of manipulation, when spiritual language becomes a means of enforcing compliance, these are not expressions of authentic faith. They are expressions of power. But because they come wrapped in the language of love and divine authority, victims often struggle to name their experience. How do you tell someone that the Bible verses your mother recited while punishing you have left you unable to read scripture without panic? How do you explain that your father's prayers were wielded like weapons? The very language we need to describe this experience has been corrupted by the experience itself. This brings us to a critical understanding. Healing from family based spiritual warfare requires acknowledging the specific spiritual harm that has occurred. Many survivors experience feeling abandoned by God or having their spiritual worldview shattered, which requires specialized healing approaches that address both psychological and spiritual dimensions of recovery. Let me share some powerful stories that illustrate these dynamics. The Mend Project has extensively documented patterns of intimate partner spiritual abuse within marriage relationships. They found victims facing manipulation through religious texts to justify sexual coercion, physical abuse, and emotional control within what should have been sacred family bonds. Sarah, a woman they work with, described how her husband would quote scripture about wives submitting to husbands before physically abusing her, then lead family prayer afterward, asking for forgiveness. For years, she believed God required her to endure this treatment. Her children grew up witnessing this distortion of faith, confused about what God truly required of them. The manipulation of religious texts created a prison more effective than any physical restraint. What made the Men Project's work so transformative was their creation of educational resources helping victims identify spiritual abuse patterns and separate abusive behaviors from authentic spiritual teachings. Sarah eventually recognized that the God her husband portrayed, vengeful, controlling, demanding submission through violence, was not the God she had once known. This allowed her to reclaim her spiritual identity separate from the abuse. The Men Project began this work after noticing how frequently religious justifications were used to maintain control in abusive relationships. Their framework for identifying spiritual abuse within intimate relationships has helped countless victims recognize their situation and find freedom. Their work has sparked crucial conversations within religious communities about the misuse of spiritual authority in family settings. This matters because healing can't happen in isolation. Communities must also acknowledge and address these harmful patterns. Another powerful example comes from research on clergy sexual abuse and its impact on spirituality. While not focused on biological family, this research provides crucial insights into the spiritual dimension of abuse by authority figures who represent spiritual family. Michael was 14 when his trusted youth pastor began grooming him, using scripture to justify increasingly inappropriate behavior. He told me God had chosen me for a special relationship, Michael explained. He said our connection was divinely ordained, that questioning it was questioning God's plan. The abuse continued for 3 years. The devastation wasn't just physical or emotional, it was spiritual. I couldn't pray anymore, Michael said. Every time I tried, I heard his voice quoting those same verses. God became unsafe to me. I lost my spiritual home. Researchers found that traditional trauma treatment often failed because it didn't address this profound spiritual crisis. Understanding the unique nature of spiritual harm led to more effective treatment approaches that address the spiritual crisis alongside psychological trauma. This research documented how spiritual abuse creates an attack on the soul and an attack on the core self or identity, validating experiences that were previously dismissed. As Coletta often emphasizes, you cannot heal what you cannot name. A third powerful story focuses on intergenerational patterns. Organizations working with parents healing from childhood spiritual trauma while trying to raise their own children. found that adults who experience spiritual abuse in their families of origin struggle with how to create healthy spiritual environments without repeating harmful patterns. James described realizing he was using the same threatening language about God's punishment that had terrorized him as a child. I caught myself telling my daughter that God was watching her and would punish her disobedience, he said, voice breaking. I was passing on the poison, even though I had promised myself I never would. Through combining spiritual principles with practical healing approaches, James learned to separate harmful religious practices from authentic spiritual nurturing. I had to unlearn before I could teach, he explained. I had to find a God of love before I could introduce my children to him. This work emerged from recognizing that many parents were unconsciously perpetuating spiritual harm because they hadn't addressed their own childhood trauma. The resources created specifically addressed how to heal from childhood spiritual abuse, while actively parenting, filling a crucial gap in recovery literature. This approach has helped break cycles of spiritual abuse across generations. As one mother put it, I'm not just healing for myself, I'm healing for my children and their children after them. What these stories reveal is that spiritual warfare within families creates unique forms of harm requiring unique approaches to healing. Traditional therapeutic approaches often miss the spiritual dimension of the injury. Traditional religious approaches often minimize the psychological trauma, or worse, reinforce harmful patterns. True healing requires integration, acknowledging both the psychological and spiritual dimensions of the harm. It requires separating abusive religious practices from authentic spiritual connection. It requires rebuilding a sense of spiritual safety that may have been shattered in childhood. As Coletta Anderson's work demonstrates, this healing is possible, but it begins with recognition, with naming the experience for what it is. The truth shall set you free is a spiritual teaching that applies powerfully here. But first, we must be willing to see the truth, even when it challenges our most cherished assumptions about family and faith. I want to leave you with this challenge. Examine the spiritual messages you received in childhood. What did they teach you about your worth, about God's nature, about your right to have boundaries, ask questions, or express emotions? If you've survived spiritual warfare in your family, your story matters. Your experience deserves to be validated. Your healing journey is sacred work. And if you've never experienced this form of abuse, I challenge you to become a witness, to listen without judgment when someone trusts you with their story, to educate yourself about spiritual abuse, to question religious teachings that justify control, shame, or manipulation, even when they come from respected leaders or beloved traditions. Because ultimately, this isn't just about healing individuals, it's about transforming our understanding of what true spirituality looks like. It's about creating families and communities where faith nurtures rather than damages, where spiritual teachings liberate rather than imprison. The most radical act of spiritual warfare is to reclaim the divine from those who have weaponized it, to insist that love cannot coexist with control, to declare that no true God requires the sacrifice of your dignity, your boundaries, or your truth. This is the revolution Coletta Anderson is leading, and today I invite you to join it. Thank you